and welcome to Crimes Through Time, snapshots of crime history. On the 19th of August 1951, Beatrice Alice Rimmer was enjoying an evening visit with her son Thomas. At around 9:45pm, she left his home on Madrid Street, Troxteth, Liverpool. Thomas walked her to the bus stop on Hyde Park Street and waved Beatrice goodbye as she boarded the number 27 bus. She travelled to Lodge Lane and got off the bus outside the Pavilion Theatre, before making the short walk down Smithdown Road to her home at 7 Cranbourne Road, located opposite Sefton General Hospital. Beatrice arrived home around 10:10. She lived alone, her husband having passed away in 1950. The following evening, Thomas called on his mum. He got no answer, but neighbour Jack Grossman caught him at the doorstep. He was concerned that the milk that had been delivered at 6am was still on the step. A morning newspaper was in the letterbox. By this time, it was 7:15pm. Although Beatrice was a reclusive character, she was a lady with a meticulous routine. Thomas peered through the letterbox and saw what he thought was a bundle of clothes on the floor. Now he was also concerned. He went to the back of the house and jumped over the back wall into the yard. As he approached the house, he saw the bottom pane of the kitchen window was smashed. He climbed through, and in the hallway, just inside the front door, he found Beatrice, dead in a large pool of clotted blood. She was still wearing her coat, her umbrella on her wrist, and in her hand the flowers Thomas had given her the night before. The post-mortem revealed Beatrice had sustained 15 separate injuries. She had been viciously beaten with 2 weapons, one being a kosh. The pattern of injuries was consistent with Beatrice being tortured. The police assumed robbery was the motive. There was a significant sum of money in the house. It was assumed that the killer had tried to extract the location of the cash from Beatrice. It was a failure, and nothing was taken from the house. Even the gas meter was intact. A massive investigation was launched. Teams of detectives worked around the clock, interviewing over 300 people in the first month alone, but they would hit a dead end. However, Detective Superintendent Hector Taylor and Detective Chief Inspector Jimmy Morris, the original officers in charge, had begun to focus on one suspect, Thomas Rimmer. The evidence was circumstantial, but they believe it gave cause to investigate Thomas further. He and Beatrice's usual pattern of visits were weeks apart. Why had he chosen to visit so soon? He had no answer. The small kitchen window he claimed he climbed through had no fibres or fingerprints on. Strangely, the shards of glass were found outside the house, on the floor of the yard. This window, in Thomas's account, was the way the attacker entered the house to lay in wait for Beatrice. There were no other signs of forced entry, but it was clearly smashed from inside the house. Thomas demonstrated to the police 3 times how he climbed through the window. Each time he couldn't do it without leaving fingerprints or fibres from his chunky jacket catching on the broken glass. They took the suspicions to Chief Superintendent Herbert Balmer. Now, if you've watched my previous videos on the Cameo murders or the unsolved murder of Maureen Dutton, his name might seem familiar, and the way he now directs the investigation would lead to another miscarriage of justice. Allegedly, of course, just my opinion. Let me know what you think. The other cases are linked in the description. I encourage you to take a look once we have discussed this case. Balmer told them they must look elsewhere. Thomas Rimmer was a former Liverpool City police officer, and for reasons I am sure are unrelated to this case, he had decided to return to duty. So where does this leave the investigation? Balmer would receive a tip from one of his network of informants, George McLaughlin, who was serving time for burglary at Walton Prison, a 19-year-old with an extensive criminal history, an army deserter and housebreaker. George claimed he met a man nicknamed Ginger in the Continental all-night cafe in Manchester. Despite this being their first meeting, they decided together to rob a house, 7 Cranbourne Road, Liverpool. The reason Beatrice's house was chosen was because George had an aunt that lived at 109 Cranbourne Road. Balmer decided that must be how he heard about the potential money and valuables in her home. Later, a third man joined the job. George made it clear to Balmer that these men were prepared to use whatever violence was necessary to complete the burglary. Balmer ran with this story and used his contacts in the Liverpool Press Club to publish a full description of Ginger, along with his known haunts. Ginger would never be found. So George told Balmer about a waitress called June Berry, who also had a role in the plan. She was to be the distraction, knocking on Beatrice's door while the men broke in through the kitchen. Fortunately for George, he would be arrested on the 17th of August on an unrelated charge, so the crime went ahead without him. Now June the police did find. She was a regular in the city's all-night cafes, plus she had skipped bail for a robbery charge from a shop in Berry Street. She named 2 Mancunian men, Alfred Burns, aged 21, and Edward Devlin, aged 22, as Beatrice's murderers. Both men were already on the run. Alfred had run away from Borstal, and Edward had skipped bail for an unrelated robbery charge. They were quickly arrested and brought to Liverpool for questioning. George picked out both men in an identification parade. Neither matched the description of Ginger, who would not be mentioned again. So when did George meet the now 4th man who would be engaged in the crime? It couldn't be his replacement. He was already in jail, so wouldn't have met him. Curious. The trial began on the 12th of February 1952 in George's Hall, Liverpool. Mr. Justice Finnemore presided. Rose Helborn QC defended Edward and Sir Noel Gildy QC defended Alfred. Unfortunately, the men behaved poorly in the courtroom. Throughout the 10 days of evidence, they would openly criticise the judge and jury. Alfred and Edward had a solid alibi for the time of Beatrice's murder. They were in Manchester, robbing a clothing warehouse, Sunblinds Limited, of £1,600 worth of goods at the time. The warehouse owner and a man who had already been convicted of the warehouse robbery testified that Alfred and Edward were there. Neither of the accused performed well on the stand. When they were questioned about the warehouse robbery, they wouldn't or couldn't go into details outside of what the prosecution claimed they could have found in the newspaper articles. They were very unconvincing. The defence challenged the police's theory. Why would these 2 men stop in the middle of a robbery in Manchester, where they had stolen a significant amount of stock, to travel to Liverpool, break into Beatrice's house, a stranger to them, kill her and steal nothing? If this crime was planned with George, Balmer's tipster, why did they schedule the crimes in different cities for the same night? The prosecution countered that they believed the warehouse robbery happened 24 hours before the murder and not the same night. The crime wasn't discovered until Monday the 20th of August. Could it have happened on the Saturday night, the 18th, rather than the 19th when the murder took place? Blood evidence was presented. Alfred's coat had blood on it. However, it was a different blood group than Beatrice's, and it could easily be explained as Alfred was frequently in bar fights. There were no fingerprints, no murder weapons were ever found, no one could place them at the scene of the crime, and the profile of the crime didn't fit the burglaries the pair usually carried out. The case all hinged on the testimony of Balmer's prison snitches. It took the jury 75 minutes to find Alfred and Edward guilty. Before the inevitable death sentence was passed, Edward placed his hands on the rail in front of the dock and addressed the judge. Quote, "My lord, I would like to stress that it means the police are not infallible to tell lies." The sentence was appealed and heard before Lord Chief Justice Goddard and Justices Ormerod and Parker. It was dismissed on the 31st of March. They refused to hear new evidence that called June Berry's testimony into question. June had told 3 friends, including Elizabeth Brooke, who had made an official statement, that her ex-boyfriend Austin O'Toole was actually responsible for the murder. But June stood by her original statement. If she was caught lying, it would mean a long sentence for perjury. Next, the defence solicitors Livermore and Norton approached the Home Secretary, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, to grant a reprieve. He took the unusual step of appointing Mr. Albert QC to examine the case. The execution was postponed for 1 week. He would report back, quote, no reasonable grounds to suggest that a miscarriage of justice had taken place, and the hangings were given the go-ahead. At 9 a.m. on Friday the 25th of April 1952 at Walton Prison, Edward Devlin and Alfred Burns were hanged by Albert Pierre Point, assisted by Sid Durnley, Robert Leslie Stewart and Harry Smith. Edward weighed 158 pounds and was given a 7'1" drop, and Alfred was 165 pounds and had a drop of 6'10". They turned off easy. It was reported to the press that they confessed on the gallows, but in Sid Durnley's memoirs, he stated that the men faced the execution in silence. In 2018, new evidence came to light that again turned suspicion onto Thomas Rimmer, Beatrice's son. It was a letter written by Beatrice to her late husband's pension provider. In it, she complains about her son and his attitude to money. Quote, I am sorry to say that I cannot look for any help or sympathy from my son. I have not dared tell him about this extra allowance. I have given and given, but now firmly resolved not another penny. Money slips like water through his hands, and now he is realising he's done. I do know that if I pass away, he would have a royal time of it for a few months. This new motive, along with the circumstantial crime scene evidence, certainly seems to me Thomas was a more likely suspect than Albert and Edward. Although this case is widely considered a miscarriage of justice, it is yet to be referred to the Court of Appeal. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and let me know what you think of this case in the comments below, and I look forward to welcoming you in the next one.